Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 5. This week, we're looking at Getting to Yes by Urian Fisher. This book, Getting to Yes, it remains one of the key texts when it comes to negotiations. I'll be brief because I think Urian Fisher cover a lot. They give a lot of great examples in their book, to make the points they're talking about very practical and applicable. Please do the reading before you watch this video. Otherwise, maybe some of it won't make sense. Helps to put things into perspective. So getting to yes, as you are hopefully aware that you have now read it, focuses on 4 key points of what they called principled negotiation. And that is separating the people from the problem, focus on the interests, not positions, invent options for mutual gain, and insist on using objective criteria. So I'll be touching on the first 3. The fourth one, I'm not going to go into so much because I believe it's pretty straightforward. And I also want to cover one point they make in the what if scenarios about knowing your BATNA. So also, if you do want to get more into this topic, they do have another book called Getting Past No. So let's get into this. To help us to kind of put things into perspective more practically into a conflict analysis, I'm going to cover the Tajikistan Civil War. That was from 1992 to 1997. First, a bit of historical context, just in case you're not familiar with this conflict. So Tajikistan is a product of the Soviet era. It is culturally and ethnically diverse. As is common amongst occupations or colonizations, the Soviet Union created Tajikistan, separating it from Uzbekistan, without regard for the traditional ethnic or cultural boundaries. Tajikistan was made a Soviet socialist republic in October 1929. The new republic included ethnic Tajiks, who were the majority in this country, but still at the time, many ethnic Tajiks were not within the country, this new country that was created. The country also included Uzbeks, Pamiris, which are a Eastern Iranian ethnic group. Russians also started arriving in the mid to late 1920s, and there are several other smaller ethnic groups. And this is the time of the ethnic makeup in the 1990s. Things have changed since then. So there are 4 main regions in Tajikistan. This is an ethnic map from the 1990s. It's according to the 1999 census. So there's this central region, which includes the capital city. I'm sure I'm going to butcher a lot of these names throughout the presentation, so excuse my pronunciation. The Dushanbe, this region is dominated by Tajiks. There is the northern province of Suk. This is formerly known as Leninabad, where this region is where most economic growth happened, especially with industry and agriculture during the Soviet era. But ethnically, it's linked more closely to Uzbekistan. And Khujand right here is the largest city in this region. There's the southern province of Katlon, which also has more arable land compared to other regions. And then there's the eastern province over here. Is a very remote region, lots of mountainous area. And there's also many different diverse groups who speak Iranian dialects. So today, Tajikistan is approximately 96% Muslim. During the Soviet era, as you can imagine, religion was heavily suppressed, despite there were some underground people who were still practicing. Just a little bit, this will become more important later as we're talking more about the conflict. The topography, you can see there's this mountainous area over in the east. It's very sparsely populated. And then a lot of the arable land is in the north and then also in the south. As you can see by the population density, most people live here in the northern region and the southern region, fewer people in the mountains. So over 90% of the country is mountainous. Because it is so mountainous, communication and travel is very difficult, even in the modern age. And because of this, there's a preservation of strong local identities based on clan and regional loyalties. There wasn't very much conflict between different groups before the Soviet Union came in. Yeah, but then when later in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, almost overnight, the forces that were keeping these, Soviet republics, including Tajikistan, together was started to, wither away. So questions of government structure and power sharing between the Soviet era communist leaders and the non-communist opposition groups soon developed into a civil war in Tajikistan. Over 150,000 people were killed, those are estimates, and about 1.5 million were displaced, either within the country or forced to leave as refugees. So just a little bit of simple background about the conflict, how it came to be. As Moscow's control was weakening in the 1980s and 1990s, political opposition forces were starting to challenge the communist leaders. While these groups were tolerated by the government, Islamic groups were banned, but they started to gain widespread support in the underground. And these opposition groups started to gain a lot more support and momentum, especially after Tajikistan declared independence in September 1991. Elections were held in November 1991, and they were won by this man, Rahman Nabiev. He was a former Communist Party first secretary, and he immediately sought to establish the dominance of his clan, the Kojant clan, who were from the excuse me, this is a tongue twister, Leninabad region, that northern region, as I was showing you. This group had political power and economic power since 1929. So things were difficult. There were demands for more egalitarian power structures, less favoritism for this one clan, or less favoritism to the former communist Soviet era leadership. So in response, Nabiev, he declared emergency powers. He created a national guard, men who were made up from his clan, and they were answerable only to himself. As you can imagine, that's a recipe for disaster. So there were violent clashes in May 1992. This is the beginnings of the Civil War between those opposition forces and the National Guard. In response to that, this is a very simplified version, but in response to that, a national reconciliation coalition was created in the government to try to, have more equal power structure between the Democrat, also with the Democratic and the Islamic opposition groups, with the communist powers that be at that time. So unfortunately, this power sharing structure didn't work out so well. The Kojant and Kulobi militias, they joined together. The Kojant were from the northern region, and the Kulobi clan were from that southern region. So they organized in protest, and fighting broke out between 1992 and 1993, and Russia and Uzbekistan were supporting. And it meant this coalition managed to oust the government and threw Nabiev out of power. And Emomali Rahman, he became the new president, the new leader, and he is a member of the Kulobi clan. This becomes important later. He became chairman of the Supreme Soviet in November 1992. Later, he transitioned to his title into be president in 1994. And actually, Emomali Rahmon is still leading Tajikistan today. Um, but even though uh, he came into power through this alliance between the Kojent and the Kulobi clan. Actually, he started to work together with his own clan, the Kulobi, to consolidate power and to kind of push out the Kojent faction. And then the other opposition forces, the Islamic groups, there were several nationalist groups, which I'll talk about later. They started to take advantage of this disruption within the government to organize themselves into the United Tajik Opposition. So hostilities reignited, and by 1996, central Tajikistan was engulfed in conflict. So and there were other forces, local warlords who were just kind of taking advantage of the chaotic situation to settle their grudges, and it was a mess. So finally, 1997, the agreement on the establishment of peace and national accord in Tajikistan was signed in Moscow between the government of Tajikistan and the United Tajik Opposition. This picture here is Emomali Rahmon, the president of Tajikistan, and this is, I'll talk about him later, he's the leader of the United Tajik Opposition, the UTO. So with all of that context, a little bit of the history of the conflict, let's look at it through the lens of getting to yes. So the first principle Uri and Fisher talk about is that separating the people from the problem. With any conflict, there will be different interests on each side, different individuals or groups, militias, governments, different people on each side. What are they hoping to achieve? Why are they engaging in war or conflict? Or what are they hoping to achieve in coming to a peace deal? So a few points I just wanted to highlight here is when we're looking at a particular conflict, there are two important aspects. There's the substance of the issue. What are they actually fighting about? What are the issues they're talking about or just can't unite on? And there is also the relationship of the parties involved. These are two separate things. Often they get all tangled up together. How is the relationship between the two parties? Is there no relationship? Why is there no relationship? Why is it difficult for them to see eye to eye? If we come in as a third party or an observer or mediator or negotiator, we have to separate those two, the substance and the relationship. So even if we're talking about the issues or talking about the problems or talking about our interests or positions, we can still relate to each other with respect and with dignity and move forward better in that way. So if we're doing a conflict analysis, what might this look like? We have to know who are the people involved. You would find that many times there is a charismatic leader who has a lot of say on how things go. For example, if you want to understand Russia and Ukraine, you have to understand Putin and Zelensky. You have to look at who are the different parties of the conflict, whether it's organizations or militias, countries, and their leaders, and what is driving them. So let us look at our case of Tajikistan. Who were the people? When negotiations started, essentially there were two major parties within Tajikistan. The main individual on the side of the government was Emomali Rahmon, formerly known as Ramanov. He later changed his last name. He was from the Kulobi clan. As I mentioned, he was also a former collective farm director. He came to power in 1993 with the help of that Kojent Kulobi militia known as the Popular Front. And after being victorious, he consolidated his own power base with his clan, and this alliance eventually fractured. And now we can look at this kind of with the benefit of hindsight. But in this case, it's important to understand this man and his slant towards authoritarianism. Um, since 2016, term limits were removed for the presidency. As I mentioned, he's still president today. He has, quote unquote, won every single election. Even today, his party, the People's Democratic Party, maintains majority in the parliament. Today, there is no independent opposition or free media. Um, and even though there was a power sharing agreement at the end of the Civil War, that eventually eroded and he further consolidated his power base. And all of these together and other points are kind of typical of this communist authoritarian style of leadership. And on the other side of the conflict was the UTO, as I mentioned. They were led by this man on the right, the top right, Saeed Abdullah Nuri. The UTO was made up of four major opposition groups, which seemingly had conflicting views, except they were united in being against the government. There was, I'm looking for the name here, the Rostokens movement and Democratic Party of Tajikistan. They were nationalist liberals. There were the Lali Badakhshan, excuse me for pronunciation. They sought the autonomy of that eastern region on the map called Badakhshan. And actually, the backbone of the UTO was the second largest political party of the country, the Islamic Renaissance Party, which sought a greater role of Islam in the state. Nuri himself was an Islamic theologian, and despite religion being suppressed under the USSR, under the Soviet Union, um, in this state, most people were Muslim. He helped to create the Islamic Rebirth Party in the 1990s. Eventually, the Islamic Rebirth Party changed its name to the Islamic Renaissance Party, and it sought a greater role for Islamic ideas and traditions in society. And as you're kind of unwinding the various parties in a conflict, it can get pretty complex. Within the UTO, it was formed during the Civil War, and one of the strongest factions was the Islamic factions. It changed its name over times, but it had ties to operating in the underground, which I mentioned. Nuri himself spent different times in prison camps for his religious activities, especially in the 1980s. The IRP gained official recognition in 1991. At one point, its stated goal was to create Tajikistan into an Islamic state, but through election victory and referendum. This goal was kind of modified later. But so even though the IRP has advocated for the revival of pure Islam and spreading the truth through the Quran and the Sunnah, it doesn't share characteristics with radical Islam. So we need to understand these things. Some of the other important people in this conflict, but interested parties included states in the region, especially Russia and Iran. They played the most important roles, and it was ultimately their collaboration which helped bring the conflict to a settlement. In this picture here, I purposely put a generic picture of Russia and Iran because even though their presidents and their leader were important, they were not as personally invested in the Tajikistan conflict. The Tajik government was supported by Russia, and the UTO was supported by Iran. So each of them, Moscow and Tehran, both had roles in pushing their allies to negotiate and served as mediators. I'll talk more about this when we get into interests of the different parties. So why do we need to understand the people who are part of a conflict? As a neutral party, we can't get caught up into the interests of each party. Like our case study with Mozambique in the beginning of this course, we have to treat them as brothers over here, treat each other with dignity and respect, building trust, and then discussing on how to resolve the problem over here. We have to understand the good and the bad about the people and where they're coming from and why. We also can't get consumed with personality problems. We can't be swayed by the charismatic leadership of any one individual. And, often individuals or groups will have their positions, their stated positions, but then their actions will say something different. So that's why we need to treat the problems separate from the people. Which brings us to our next point, which is focusing on interests, not positions. It's the interests that define the problem. And how do we identify the interests? We have to ask why and why not. If this group or that group wants this or that, we ask why. Why do they want that? And why is that their position? And what will they gain because of having that position fulfilled? If we look at the different parties in the conflict in Tajikistan, in our example, we could conclude that this is about a secular state versus a religious state. You have the secular communist government, and then you also have the Islamic elements who are, very powerful within the UTO. We could think it's pro-government and pro-communist forces versus those that want Islam to have a greater role in the state. But actually, if we dive deeper beyond those positions, intertwined with that, in this case, is our regional identities. So this is from an analysis of the conflict. I'll just read it for you here. Regional identities were closely linked to political affiliations during the Tajik Civil War. Tajikistan is predominantly rural country. Even in urban areas, many retain connections to their family villages, and neighborhoods are often inhabited by people from the same region. Tajik society retains strong traditional networks of solidarity, commonly referred to as clans, built on these family and local community ties. These networks have commonly been used to maximize access to and control over resources, and they were translated into the political administrative structures of the Soviet Union. Excuse me. So here's our map again. Historically, especially under the Soviets, elites from this Leninabad, this northern region, were favored. This region has, as a whole, received more industrial growth, and that meant higher education. So people from this region had greater economic and social influence. Just for example, all of the Tajik Communist Party first secretaries between 1946 and 1991 were from this region. And when they're in positions of power, they could favor their own clan for other positions or access to goods or other benefits. So the tension of regional identity and clan was exacerbated by the policy of the Soviet Union to forcibly relocate people to meet labor demands. Entire groups, a whole clan or a village would be moved, generally from the eastern or the central mountainous regions into a single collective farm into the north or south regions. So even when they're being moved, they maintained distinct group identities. And, just as you can imagine, if you are forced to leave your home and live somewhere else unfamiliar, it makes your group relationships stronger since you have to rely on each other. This traumatic thing, this, upending of your whole life just happened to you. So it can unfortunately have the added effect of increasing the sense that it's us versus them. So in the early 1990s, the only political elite from the old political elite from Leninabad had allied with the people from the Kulobi clan. This elite from Leninabad, that's also known as the Kojand or Kujand clan. There are many different names here. The Kulobis, they had been underrepresented during the Soviet era, but they had the ability to mobilize armed militias. So it looked like, a great alliance. Um, but then the balance of power shifted from the Cogent, the Leninabad clans to the Kulobi as the war continued. And by the end of the decade, this old guard from this northern region had been marginalized, and the Kulobi had retained power. Amongst the opposition parties, most identified themselves by ideology, but they drew support from a particular region. The Islamic Renaissance Party had a stronghold in the Southwest amongst families who had relocated from the mountainous regions and who had been forcibly relocated to the cotton fields of the Vaksh Valley during the Soviet period. The Democratic Party of Tajikistan, they had a nationalist agenda, but they was composed mostly of Dushanbe-based intellectuals. That's from the capital region. The Lale Bakshan, they were mostly Pamiris, and they were advocating for greater autonomy of the mountainous eastern regions, Badakhshan of eastern Tajikistan. Their political positions were different, but they had a shared interest of changing power dynamics from that one regional group, the Kojent and the Kulobis, and later mostly the Kulobis. They wanted to change the power dynamics so power could be shared, and then power is shared, and access to resources and goods and benefits could be shared more equally. So the dynamics of power sharing, as you can see, had a very strong regional element. But both the government and the UTO were unwilling to give up their foothold in their respective regions. The Kulobi-dominated government in particular was resistant to equal participation because they had only recently taken that power from the Leninabad or the Kojant clan, who had been favored under the Soviet Union. So they weren't going to easily just give it up. So we have to understand their positions and especially the interests behind the positions in order to get to our next point, which is to invent options for mutual gain. Find the shared interests. We can't get caught up in thinking that there's only a fixed pie, there's only a fixed amount of power to be shared. Interests may seem incompatible. So sometimes we need to be creative and find where are the places where there are shared interests. Eventually, what really pushed these groups into a peace settlement, including with the pressure from Russia and Iran, was changing dynamics within the region. Here we go. Here's our map again. Bordering with Tajikistan was Afghanistan. As mentioned, Iran and Russia had a significant influence in pushing forward negotiations, especially because they had an interest in seeing the outcome of the war. From Iran's perspective, as fellow Persian-speaking country, Tajikistan shares a common cultural and historical heritage. Oh, there we go. I thought I had a slide for this. Russia, on the other hand, supported the Roman regime, Romanov, because Moscow had supported his rise to power and his regime's rise to power, especially because they wanted to undermine Uzbekistan's influence in the region. And Russia was also very much interested in the potential challenge of conflict spilling over into other parts, other region, other countries in the area, because at that time it was also dealing with Chechnya. But an important shared interest for Russia and Iran was they also did not want the US or Turkey to meddle in this region. But things changed, and a big shared interest came up in 1996 when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan and the capital fell. It's right next door. So Afghanistan falls to the Taliban in 1996. So a key concern for all the parties involved was this question of militant radical Islam spreading into their country. The country is unstable. They've been experiencing civil war for several years. So it's not in a very strong position to be able to combat those elements if they started to try to get a foothold into the mountainous regions of Tajikistan. And Russia also regarded Tajikistan as its southernmost border. So it wanted to also see the country as like a buffer for stopping the spread of radical Islam. Iran itself also did not look on Taliban's rise to power favorably. And ultimately, Iran saw its relationship with Russia as more important than supporting the Islamic agenda of the UTO. Other states in Central Asia also feared the spread of militant Islam, so they also became more involved in giving pressure to these two sides to come together and sign a deal. So even though the government and the opposition, they shared different interests and different positions, as I mentioned, they found common ground. Their shared interest was to stop the spread of the Taliban's version of radical Islam. Yeah. So finally, I want to touch on one more important point from Urry and Fisher, which I think you need to understand when you're doing your conflict analysis, and that is BATNA. BATNA stands for the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. I apologize. I think my video is probably covering that part of the slide. So basically the question is, if there's no agreement, what will each side do? What would I do if I can't come to an agreement? And what would the other side do? You have to know your own BATNA, and you also have to know the BATNA of the other side. What is the best alternative option? Creating a BATNA, that Urry and Fisher say, involves a few steps. You have to invent a list of actions you could take if no agreement is reached. Improve the best ideas into practical alternatives. If you have a bunch of lists of things that are not practical and not possible, you might have to brainstorm a little more or think of how to make one or two of those more practical or possible. And then finally, select the option that seems the best as the best alternative. The better your BATNA, the better your leverage in a negotiation, even if the other side seems to have a lot more power than you. In an armed conflict, the BATNA is often to continue fighting. If the other side doesn't want to meet our terms or doesn't want to change, then, we can keep going. That is our BATNA. In the case of Tajikistan, this definitely seemed to be the case. Negotiations started in 1994, but there were many deadlocks and setbacks, and both sides just continued fighting because the other side didn't want to budge. A ceasefire agreement was signed in October 1994, but there were violations on both sides. And even though the UN was also involved in supporting as a mediator, trust was very difficult to build. So for the UTO and Tajikistan, the government of Tajikistan, the BATNA was just continue fighting. For these groups that had a nationalist agenda, maybe their BATNA was to create their own state. they would have to make moves to maybe make that a more practical possibility if that is a real, they want to make it a real alternative. Um, but again, in this case, everything changed when the Taliban took over Afghanistan. The Batna, in that case, became continuing to fight while also dealing with the repercussions of radical Islam gaining a greater foothold in the country, especially in those remote mountainous areas which no sides of the conflict wanted that. So for the UTO and for the government of Tajikistan, their batnas also became having to negotiate with the increased international pressure from Iran and Russia. For a while, they were kind of okay. Iran and Russia were fine with kind of just leaving the things the way they were, um, but eventually that completely changed. And so the UTO and the government are dealing with extra pressure to compromise. So yeah, as a final note, even though the Civil War ended with an agreement at the end in 1997 signed by the UTO and the Tajik government, the country has yet to reach that transformative peace. Despite early headway made in implementing the power sharing portion of the agreement, the peace agreement was not fully implemented, and the government actually began reversing some of the progress within a few years. Rahman originally allowed there was an agreement in this deal that was signed for 30% of a quota appointed to UTO leaders into high positions of the government, but that was not fully implemented, and yeah, so it is unfortunate. The president's increased authoritarianism also has a toll on religious freedom and the freedom of speech. And there are very few independent media, and religious minorities face intolerance, especially the Muslim population. And because the regime is terrified that these groups could find a basis for future political challenging. Be that as may, there has not been a widespread outbreak of violence at the same level as seen during the Civil War. So we could say that there is a negative peace achieved here, not a positive peace yet. Yeah, so I hope this was informative to you. I'll include some of the resources in this week's post in case you wanted to check some of them out a little further. And I hope you learned a lot from getting to yes. Many of those principles and key points are very beneficial, not just for analyzing a conflict, but if you would take a role as a mediator or a negotiator, or someone who is trying to bring things to a positive solution. So I'll be in touch. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and thank you.